The HVAC system in the Chicago high-rise hummed a low, steady note, completely at odds with the digital bleeding happening across the network. I stood in the center of the corner office, the heavy canvas strap of my backpack biting into the shoulder of my charcoal suit. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city skyline was a jagged line of gray and steel against a bruised afternoon sky. I looked down at the physical security log on my tablet. The visual discrepancy was impossible to ignore. The access timestamp on the primary server read 4 a.m., but the physical badge reader for the server room had been entirely disabled since midnight. Someone was inside the network, and they had walked through the front door. I looked up at Isabel Joseph. She stood on the opposite side of her massive mahogany desk, the picture of absolute corporate armor. She wore a plunging emerald green dress that cut a sharp, tailored silhouette against the gray light of the window. Her blonde hair was blown out to perfection, her red lipstick precise, but her knuckles were white where her hands gripped the edge of the desk. Beside her right hand sat a framed photo of her nieces and nephews, the only personal item in an otherwise sterile room. I stepped forward and held out the black leather folder containing the preliminary breach report. As I extended my arm, a piece of paper slipped from the back of the stack and landed right on top of the grim data. It was a crayon drawing of a lopsided blue dog, rendered with heavy, enthusiastic strokes. I had to pull Liliana out of school early today due to a fever, and she had spent an hour at my temporary desk drawing it before my sister picked her up. I watched Isabel's gaze drop to the childish artwork, the harsh lines of her posture faltering for a fraction of a second. She took the folder. The silence in the room became heavy, pressing against the glass. Something irreversible had just started.
"Tell me this is a drill, Thomas," she said, her voice smooth, but the cadence was too fast.
"It's not a drill," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "You have a continuous, unauthorized data exfiltration on port 443. It's masked as standard encrypted traffic, but the payload size is wrong." I watched her process the information. She didn't panic. She didn't raise her voice. She simply closed her eyes for 2 seconds, took a sharp breath, and opened them again. The armor slid right back into place. "How long do we have before the client data is compromised?" she asked. "I initiated a sandbox isolation protocol 20 minutes ago," I stated, using the exact technical nouns to ground the situation. "I severed the external handshake, but the malicious payload is already inside the local environment. It's attempting to replicate across the financial servers. I have 84 hours to trace the origin code before the automated backup cycle overwrites the infiltration path." Isabel let out a slow, shaky exhale, the sound barely carrying over the hum of the ventilation. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. The relief wasn't because the problem was solved. It was because someone else in the room understood the exact dimensions of the disaster and wasn't running for the exit. Before she could issue an order, the heavy glass door of her office swung open. Jackson Hart walked in, entirely unbothered by the concept of knocking. He was the VP of Compliance, a man who built his career by standing on the mistakes of others. He held a sleek silver tablet in his hand. A smug expression settled permanently on his face. "Isabel," Jackson said, his voice carrying an artificial warmth. "I just got a very interesting automated alert from the firewall. Care to explain why our entire vendor payment subnet is locked down?" I watched Isabel's spine straighten. She stepped out from behind the desk, placing herself between Jackson and the folder I had just handed her.
"A routine stress test," Isabel said smoothly. "Thomas is running a diagnostic."
Jackson's eyes slid over to me, assessing my suit, my backpack, and the lack of a VP title on my ID badge. "A stress test during end-of-quarter billing? That's incredibly reckless, Isabel. If the board finds out you're causing artificial delays—" "I initiated the lockdown," I interrupted. I kept my voice flat, devoid of any challenge, merely a conveyor of facts. Under Section 4 of the Emergency Cybersecurity Mandate, independent auditors possess unilateral authority to isolate subnets if traffic anomalies exceed the baseline by 40%. Jackson stopped smiling. He looked at me, realizing he couldn't bully an independent contractor who knew the rule book better than he did. 40%? Jackson pressed. That sounds like a breach. Do we have a breach, Isabel? I didn't let her answer. We have an anomaly, I corrected, stepping slightly to my right, physically intercepting his line of sight to her desk. And until my diagnostic is complete, any speculation is a violation of the firm's internal security non-disclosure policy. I'll have a report for the executive committee when I'm finished. Jackson tightened his grip on his tablet. He hated the boundary, but he couldn't cross it without violating policy in front of a witness. Make it fast, he snapped, turning on his heel and leaving the office. The door clicked shut. Isabel looked at me. The tension in her jaw was stark. She was a woman used to fighting every battle alone, and the sudden quiet in the room felt heavy. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. I control the information flow until the network is secure, I replied, keeping my hands resting loosely at my sides. He doesn't have clearance for an ongoing forensic trace. You do. She walked over to the window, looking out at the fading daylight. The Chicago skyline was beginning to light up, a grid of gold and white against the encroaching dark. He's been trying to force me out for 6 months, she admitted, her voice lacking its usual corporate polish. If this leak is real and the client data goes public, he won't just take my job. He'll make sure I never work in this city again. Then we make sure it doesn't go public, I said. She turned to face me. The green of her dress caught the ambient light from the hallway. This isn't just a patch job, Thomas. This is going to take days. I need to know exactly what they took. She hesitated, her professional mask slipping enough to show the absolute exhaustion underneath. Do you want to stay tonight? We can order food. I can give you full admin override. I looked at her. I saw the high-powered executive terrified of failing, and I saw the woman who just needed someone to share the weight. I gave a dry, tired smile. Isabel, I'm a single dad. My wild Friday nights usually consist of folding tiny dinosaur socks and falling asleep on the couch by 9 p.m. while watching an animated movie. Staying late to hunt malicious code in a silent office is the most action I've seen all year. A sudden, genuine laugh broke from her. It was a beautiful sound, unexpected and bright, completely altering the atmosphere of the room. The tight lines around her eyes smoothed out. The joke was a small thing, but it shifted the ground beneath us. I wasn't just a faceless contractor anymore. I was a human being with dinosaur socks and a couch. Dinosaur socks, she repeated, shaking her head. All right, let's get to work. Over the next 4 hours, the office transformed into a bunker. I set up my primary workstation at the small conference table in the corner of her office. The ambient noise of the city faded, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of my keyboard. I pulled the raw hex data from the compromised server. The code was elegant, written to look like legitimate backup requests. Isabel sat at her desk, buried in vendor contracts and compliance manuals, trying to determine exactly which accounts were at risk. I watched her out of the corner of my eye. She hadn't stopped moving since Jackson left. She read documents with a fierce, punishing intensity. I ran a reverse shell trace on the corrupted packets. The TLS handshake had been spoofed using an internal credential. I isolated the sandbox environment and ran a hash check on the payload. The technical reality was grim. The credential used belonged to a senior executive. I placed my phone face down on the table. It was a deliberate motion, shutting out the rest of the world to focus entirely on the space we were in. I watched Isabel rub her temple, a small gesture of fatigue she thought no one saw. She was running on adrenaline and stale coffee. I stood up, walked over to her side of the office, and reached for the thermostat on the wall. I bumped the temperature up 2 degrees. She looked up, startled. What are you doing? You've been shivering for the last 20 minutes, I said plainly. I didn't wait for a thank you. I walked over to the small kitchenette in the executive lounge next door and poured 2 glasses of water. When I returned, I set one down exactly 3 inches from her right hand. "Drink," I instructed quietly. She stared at the glass, then up at me. "I have to finish reviewing these non-disclosure clauses." "The clauses won't change in the next 60 seconds, I said. I pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. "You are useless to this company if you collapse. Drink the water, Isabel." It wasn't a request, it was a boundary. She held my gaze for a long moment, testing the authority in my voice. Then, slowly, she reached for the glass and took a long drink. The silence in the room wasn't tense anymore. It was the quiet room principle in action. The chaos of the data breach, Jackson's ambition, the corporate politics, it all stopped at the edge of the mahogany desk. I was creating a timeout zone, a small pocket of stability where she didn't have to be the boss. "Thank you," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Don't thank me for basic maintenance," I replied, opening my laptop again. I kept my hands firmly on the keyboard. The next few days were a blur of logistics and quiet proximity. We developed a rhythm. I arrived at 7 a.m. after dropping Liliana at school. Isabel was always already there, her armor polished, fighting the daily fires of a major corporation. By 6 p.m., the rest of the floor emptied out, and it was just us in the secure zone. On Tuesday evening, the sky outside was a heavy, bruised purple, dumping rain against the glass. I was knee-deep in firewall logs when my phone vibrated. It was a text from my sister, a picture of Liliana holding up a spelling test with a gold star. I smiled, a rare, unguarded expression. "What is it?" Isabel asked from across the room. "Liliana," I said. "She got a perfect score on her spelling test." Isabel stood up and walked over to my table. She didn't hover, but she stood close enough that I could smell the faint trace of vanilla and rain on her clothes. I turned the phone so she could see. Her face softened completely. "She has your eyes," Isabel murmured. "She has my stubbornness," I corrected. "Her eyes belong to her mother." It was a simple statement of fact. My ex-wife had walked away when Liliana was 2, deciding motherhood wasn't her path. I didn't carry bitterness, only a fierce, protective guard over my daughter's stability. Isabel looked at me, understanding the weight of the sentence without needing me to explain the history. She didn't offer pity. She simply nodded. "She's beautiful, Thomas." She lingered for a second longer than necessary. I kept my hands flat on the table. The urge to reach out to brush a stray lock of blonde hair from her cheek was sudden and sharp. I clamped down on it instantly. I was a contractor. She was the COO. The line between us was professional, and crossing it would compromise her position. I turned my attention back to the screen, utilizing discipline as a shield. "The internal credential used for the breach," I said, my voice strictly business. I finally unmasked the ID. Isabel stepped back, the professional distance reestablished. "Whose is it?" "It belongs to Jackson Hart." She froze. "Jackson? That's impossible. He's ambitious, but he's not suicidal. Leaking client data would destroy the firm." "He's not leaking it externally," I explained, pulling up the routing map. "He's moving it to an unsecured legacy server in the basement, a server that is scheduled for a vulnerability audit tomorrow. He's staging a catastrophic failure." Isabel saw the board immediately. "He creates the crisis, discovers the leak himself during the audit, and blames my operational oversight for leaving the legacy server connected to the main grid. The board fires me, and he plays the hero." "Exactly," I said. Before we could formulate the next move, my phone buzzed with an automated alert. The screen flashed red. I grabbed it, my pulse steadying into a tactical rhythm. "What is it?" she asked. "The financial freeze," I said, the words tasting like metal. Jackson didn't wait for the audit. He just executed a hard lock on the vendor payment accounts, citing a detected security anomaly. He's escalating. Isabel grabbed the edge of the table. Tomorrow is the end of the month. If those vendors aren't paid, we violate 15 separate service-level agreements. The penalty clauses will bankrupt the operational budget. He's forcing a board vote, I deduced.
He'll present the freeze as a necessary containment measure due to your negligence. She turned away, pacing toward the window. The rain lashed against the glass. I could see the tremor in her hands. The weight of the corporate machinery was crushing her. "I have to call the board chairman," she said, her voice tight, bordering on panic. "I have to explain." "Explain what?" I asked quietly, staying in my chair. "That your VP went rogue? Without proof of the data staging, it looks like you're covering your tracks." "Then what do we do?" she asked, turning back to me. The armor was gone. She was looking at me for a lifeline. I stood up. I didn't walk toward her. I maintained a safe, respectful distance, anchoring the room with absolute stillness. We let him hold his meeting tomorrow. We let him present his narrative. "Thomas, if he presents that narrative, I'm terminated before noon." "I have the hex logs," I said plainly. "I have the timestamp of his credential access in the legacy server. I just need physical access to that specific server to pull the hardware MAC address. That proves it was his terminal, not a spoofed IP." "The basement servers are locked behind a biometric cage," she said. "My access was revoked an hour ago when he initiated the freeze. I just got the automated email." "My contractor badge still works," I said, "because I'm classified as external auditing." She looked at me, realizing the risk I was taking. "If you pull that hardware data without a formal work order and Jackson catches you, he'll press charges for corporate espionage. You'll lose your license." "He won't catch me," I said. "Thomas, you have a daughter," she argued, stepping closer. The vanilla scent was stronger now. "You can't risk your livelihood for this. For me." I looked down at her. The vulnerability in her eyes was a quiet room I wanted to stay in permanently. I stopped myself from reaching out. I put my hands in my pockets, gripping the fabric to keep them still. "I don't work for Jackson Hart," I said softly. "I work for you, and I don't lose." I left the office at midnight, the rain soaking through my suit as I walked to the train. The next morning, the corporate floor was a war zone. Whispers of the financial freeze echoed in the break rooms. I dropped my backpack at my temporary desk and headed straight for the basement. The legacy server room was a concrete box, loud with the roar of industrial cooling fans. I swiped my contractor badge. The light flashed green. The door clicked open. I moved with precision, locating rack 4B. I bypassed the interface and plugged my diagnostic cable directly into the hardware port. I needed the MAC address of the machine that initiated the transfer. It took 4 minutes of writing raw command lines. The fan noise was deafening, a physical pressure in the room. The terminal spit out the data string. I saved it to my encrypted drive, pulled the cable, and walked out. At 10 a.m., the executive board met in the glass-walled conference room on the 45th floor. I stood by the door, an invisible contractor blending into the wood paneling. Isabel sat at the head of the table, her posture immaculate, the green dress replaced by a severe charcoal suit. Jackson stood at the front, a projected slide showing the frozen accounts. "It is with deep regret that I had to initiate the lockdown," Jackson addressed the 5 board members. "But our operational oversight has failed. A legacy server, which Isabel Joseph assured us was decommissioned, was left connected to the primary subnet. Last night, I discovered a massive data leak originating from that vulnerability." The murmurs around the table were damning. Isabel didn't flinch. Jackson slid a thick document across the table toward Isabel. "Given the severity of the negligence, the legal team has drafted a mutual separation agreement. It includes a strict non-disclosure clause.
If you sign it, the company won't pursue damages for the breach. It was a trap. Sign and admit guilt. Refuse and get fired publicly with a lawsuit. Isabel looked at the document. She reached for a pen. I stepped forward. The movement drew the eyes of the entire room. I didn't ask for permission. I walked directly to the table, reached over Isabel's shoulder, and picked up the separation agreement. "Excuse me," Jackson snapped. "Security, remove the contractor." I ignored him. I read the termination clause in 4 seconds. It was a standard boilerplate trap. I gripped the document in both hands and ripped it straight down the middle. The sound of tearing paper was loud in the silent room. I dropped the halves onto the polished wood. "The agreement is invalid," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute certainty, "because the premise of the termination is fraudulent." "Who the hell are you?" the board chairman demanded. "Thomas Vaughn, independent cybersecurity auditor," I said. I pulled the encrypted drive from my pocket and set it gently on the table in front of the chairman. That drive contains the hardware MAC address of the terminal that initiated the data transfer to the legacy server. It also contains the reverse shell trace of the internal credential used. Jackson's face lost its color. "He's fabricating data to protect her. This is a desperate—" "The MAC address belongs to the desktop terminal in the Vice President of Compliance's office," I continued, speaking over him with calm, devastating volume. Jackson Hart executed the transfer at 2:14 a.m. on Tuesday. He bypassed the firewall using his own administrative privileges to stage a crisis. The room went dead silent. The chairman picked up the drive. "Can you verify this, Mr. Vaughn?" "The data is cryptographically signed by the server's internal clock," I said, looking directly at Jackson. "It is measurable, verifiable reality." Jackson opened his mouth, but no words came out. The trap had snapped shut, not on Isabel, but on him. The board chairman looked at Jackson, the corporate executioner calculating the damage. "Jackson," the chairman said quietly, "step outside." The aftermath was a swift, brutal corporate cleanup. By 3 p.m., Jackson Hart was escorted from the building by security. The financial freeze was lifted. The vendors were paid. At 6 p.m., the 40th floor was empty again. I was packing up my backpack in the corner of Isabel's office. The crisis was over. My contract was technically fulfilled. The void I carried inside me, the quiet isolation of my routine, was waiting for me at the elevator banks. Isabel walked in. She looked exhausted, victorious, and completely real. "The board wants to retain your firm permanently," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Double your current rate." "I'll have my agency send over the paperwork," I said, zipping the backpack. I slung the bag over my shoulder and walked toward the door. I stopped 3 feet from her, the safe distance. "Thomas," she said softly. I looked at her. "Yes." "You risked your license today. You stepped into a firing line you didn't have to." "I fixed a problem," I said stubbornly, unwilling to put a romantic label on a terrifying risk. She stepped closer. The vanilla scent wrapped around the quiet room. She looked up at me, her eyes tracking the rigid line of my jaw. "You tore up a legal document in front of the chairman." "It was a bad contract," I replied. She smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. She reached into the pocket of her suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to me. I unfolded it. It was the crayon drawing of the blue dog. "Liliana left this on my desk on Monday," Isabel said. I kept it. I stared at the drawing, the tether pulling tight in my chest. "Why?" "Because it reminded me that there is a whole world outside this glass box," she said. She took one more step, crossing the boundary. The distance vanished. She didn't touch me, but her presence was an arrival. It felt like walking out of a storm and hearing the door click shut behind you. Finality. Certainty. "I'm hosting a small dinner on Saturday," Isabel said, her voice steady, stripping away all the corporate pretense. "Just a few people from my inner circle. I want you to come. And bring Liliana. My nieces will be there." It was a public choice, a boundary drawn in the sand, claiming us as a unit in front of her world. I looked at her, deleting the professional excuses I normally use to keep people at bay. I took a breath. I let the armor drop. "Saturday," I said. "We'll be there." Her smile reached her eyes. She leaned in, closing the final inch between us. The kiss was not frantic, not searching. It was the heavy, grounding drop of an anchor. A promise sealed without words, transferring stability from my life to hers, and from hers to mine. The chaotic noise of the city outside the window vanished entirely. You know, looking back now, I realize something fundamental about the walls we build. Rock bottom isn't the end. It's the solid foundation you build the rest of your life on. We spend so much time trying to be invincible, perfectly compartmentalized, believing that if we never show our exhaustion, we can never be hurt. But real strength isn't about fighting every battle alone. It's about finding the person who sees your exhaustion and silently hands you a glass of water. It's about letting someone else hold the shield for a minute, so you can finally breathe. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.